Hi there Waltoners, I'm Jack and this is DSNY Newscast, and let's just get straight into it. As it goes without saying, but COVID-19 is going to remain a very real threat to public health until there is widespread availability of vaccinations or there's some form of therapeutic treatment for this new virus. And so, as the world begins to emerge from these lockdowns, every section of society is going to have to adapt to a new normal to ensure that the reproductive rate of the virus remains below 1-to-1 transmission. And so for the Walt Disney Company, that means implementing new measures to ensure the health and safety of their guests above all else. And so that brings us to the news that Shanghai Disneyland has officially reopened, with operational modifications throughout the entire park experience. However, here's a quick summary of those measures that were going to be put into place, with the first being control capacity restrictions, which means incrementally increasing attendance by 5,000 guests per week until it eventually gets capped at 24,000 guests or 30% of the park's capacity. Then the next measure will be to limit ticket availability that is specific to certain dates, with guests needing a valid reservation beforehand before attending, and also they'll need to be in compliance with the Shanghai government health app that is an early detection system to help aid contact tracing. And then the other measures include mandatory face mask use by cast members and guests alike, social distancing markers throughout the park's queues and restaurants, and no parades, nighttime spectaculars, meet and greet characters, or indoor theatres and shows, with a final measure to dramatically increase sanitation practices and procedures throughout the entire park. Now all of this does sound like a great start, and I do commend Disney for trying to establish new best-in-class standards when it comes to this new and difficult era. However, personally, I do feel that it was a little soon to reopen Shanghai Disneyland, as despite remaining optimistic about the future of Disney parks and the eventual reopenings, I just feel that some of these measures could have been improved, and we'll get to that later. But I also understand that this decision-making process wasn't 100% Disney's, as instead Shanghai Disneyland is half owned by the Chinese government, so that could have played a bigger factor here. However, now that this park has reopened, it actually does serve a great opportunity for Disney to use Shanghai as a blueprint and a testing ground to better understand what works and what doesn't work when it comes to social distancing within a Disney park environment. And so I'm guessing that there's going to be a lot of lessons learnt over the coming weeks. And thankfully, we've now received quite a few videos of the opening day of Shanghai Disneyland, with the most illuminating being the press tour of the park prior to the reopening with the Senior Vice President of Operations, Andrew Bolstein. So let's begin with the reservation system, as guests will be required to show a valid QR code reservation before being able to begin any of the park's entry process. And in actuality, this is a very similar setup to that of a boarding group system that was in place for the opening of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland, where that system was a randomized reservation lottery taking place on the website every time you refreshed the page. So considering that the US parks have prior experience with all of this, it should be expected that this type of reservation system will most likely be applied when Walt Disney World and Disneyland eventually reopen. But importantly, this is something to note for annual pass holders, as those who have booked accommodation on Disney property or have a valid dated ticket for entry will most likely have guaranteed access to a park for that day, as Disney will be able to monitor the bookings and limited dated tickets to control the overall expected capacity within the guidelines, whereas annual pass holders will need to make a reservation ahead of time. But it should be noted that at Shanghai Disneyland, they have committed to extending the annual passes automatically throughout the period of time that this reservation system is in place. So beyond that information at this time, it's going to be interesting to see how this is applied at Walt Disney World and also Disneyland. Then we come to the second part of the arrival and entry experience, and that is the process of health checks and screening procedures through long-range thermal scanning for high temperatures and the confirmation of your health status through local government contact tracing apps. Now, in all honesty here, temperature checks are limited in their effectiveness, as they will only help Disney find those with active high temperatures whilst they're in line. Whereas, as we all know from numerous studies, that the problem with COVID-19 is the majority of those who contract COVID-19 will be asymptomatic and thus will not show any visible symptoms such as a high temperature. So in many ways this measure won't be as effective and is more of a type of security theatre. But the second part of this, which is the contact tracing app or early anomaly detection system makes a lot of sense, and in my opinion is a measure that is a must when it comes to entering a Disney park under these current circumstances, as inevitably when you enter the park you'll be coming into some form of proximity with other guests throughout your entire experience, and it's only responsible by Disney to help coordinate the facilitation of this vital data to whether you have been potentially exposed to a later confirmed case of COVID-19, which will help the local governments trace, track and contact those who have been exposed and ask them to responsibly self-isolate to help slow the spread of the virus. But this particular policy poses a significant challenge for US parks, as the enrollment in health monitoring and contact tracing apps will remain voluntary, as it has so far across most nations. And so if the majority of guests are not using a form of health monitoring app, then the overall effectiveness of this contact tracing is dramatically reduced. But then the second issue is the cooperation that's needed across not only state borders, but also internationally when it comes to foreign visitors eventually returning, as most of the apps should be using a unified standard based upon the API provided by both Apple and Google. But before we move on, the final element of the entry process poses potentially the biggest risk, and that is the current system of the bag checks, as not only will those cast members potentially be the most exposed to viral load, but if the gloves are not changed in between the screenings, then there is a possibility for large-scale cross-contamination between different guests when they had their personal items screened. And so I would suggest that some sort of X-ray machine like could be found at an airport might be a better measure to implement here, as this is already the case with Disneyland Paris and their bag check procedure. Then we come to the social distancing markers placed throughout the park, and to be honest, the visual design language and the implementation leaves a lot to be desired, as in the queues at the park's main entrance, these social distancing markers dictate where you are not allowed to stand. But then later, once inside the park, the markers change their purpose to dictate where you are only able to stand. And so it's this inconsistency of the visual design principles that will inevitably lead to guest confusion and an overall erosion of the compliance in the social distancing, as can already be seen with these examples throughout the video tour of the new measures where the press did not adhere to the 1 meter rule within China, and then in these videos again from Twitter where guests are already not staying within the taped markers on the floor for the entertainment offerings. And so despite Disney's intention, the execution does seem a little rushed, as no matter how much this is supplemented by cast members enforcing the rules, this is going to be a massive problem once the capacity increases to 30% and the amount of guests vastly outweigh the amount of cast members. And so to improve on this, I would suggest that the design language needs to be unified, meaning that Disney needs to choose whether they're going to tell people where to stand or they're going to tell people where not to stand, and keep it consistent throughout the entire park. But also they could include colour coding that is already ubiquitous with traffic signals, along with more symbols and iconography and patterns to indicate what to do. And so for instance, green tape could indicate where to stand with a suitable feet placement, suggested capacity through iconography, and also the clear purpose for this marker to be on the ground. Then yellow could be used for directional patterns, which could indicate to keep moving or no stopping in the attraction queues or restaurants within that zone. And then red markers with clearly defined iconography could be used to mean do not stand here or wait in this zone. But the important thing is that guests will need to be reminded of this system around the park as well in the signage, which is something which I haven't really seen in any of the footage so far from Shanghai, except for cast members holding up signage and trying to remind the guests. But then we come to the current system of these social distancing markers in the attraction queues that seem extremely problematic and could be improved with plexiglass partitions in the rows of switchbacks. But also the biggest advantage for Walt Disney World and Disneyland is their prior experience of virtual queuing with the opening of Rise of Resistance that could be rolled out to many more attractions with confined indoor spaces that consist of many different switchbacks like Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, whereas something like Space Mountain, where much of the queue is one long continuous pathway, could reasonably reopen with social distancing markers. But then the other issue is the dining environments, as we can see here that there are only small paper tags on the tables asking guests to not use them and adhere to the social distancing measures, which we all know from visiting a Disney park with any sort of capacity, they will inevitably be moved or ignored over time. So I feel that a better measure would be to place red tape around the tables and chairs if they need to be left in place, or remove the table and chairs altogether, thus forcing the social distancing measures between the guests instead of asking the guests to comply. And very quickly, the queuing experience for the quick service dining options, as can be seen here, seems to be extremely confusing, especially when you consider that open air food delivery is one of the highest risk scenarios for contracting the virus. But there is one area of social distancing that will be easy for Disney to enforce, and that is the spacing between guests on board the rides. As can be seen here with Pirates of the Caribbean, that there is a staggered spacing between the rows to ensure that distance is maintained. But the problem here is that it will inevitably increase the wait times, as the hourly capacity for each of the attractions is going to be roughly half of what it used to be. Although the overall capacity in the park is also going to be reduced, the sanitation procedures for rides like Flight of Passage or Millennium Falcon may dramatically reduce the overall capacity of that attraction. But then we come to the most controversial measure, and that is the mandatory face mask or face coverings for both cast members and guests alike. And even in China, where face masks are more commonplace, examples can already be seen where guests are not strictly adhering to this policy. But then as it relates to Walt Disney World and Disneyland, we come to this clip from CNBC of Disney CEO Bob Chapek.
Along with social distancing, one of the things that we're likely going to require is masks for both the cast and the guest. And I think the masks for the guest will be something that culturally is different.
So if this policy is brought to all Disney parks as is suggested, then this will be difficult to implement both from a cultural and climate-based perspective. As first of all, the cultural perspective is something that I think that Disney will be able to enforce over time, as guests will see the logic and necessity for the use of face masks when they're met with a vast amount of people gathered together, as is the case within a Disney park environment. And we also know from history that Disney managed to enforce the no selfie stick rule within the parks as well. But the big difference here is that guests may be in agreement with this principle in theory, but then will have a change of mind when it comes to actually practicing it. As is already the case in Shanghai Disneyland, where on day one guests were removing the mask to take photos, pull the mask down below the nose line when it was getting too hot, and eventually removing the mask altogether. And this is because, no matter how good the thinking is behind this principle, the heat and the humidity of Florida will make face mask use extremely difficult to implement. But either way, I can see that this is a measure that needs to be worked over a little bit more to ensure that there will be 100% compliance, or as close to that number, amongst guests. However, lastly, we come to one area that will be the most effective in combating this virus, and it's already an area that Disney excels at. And that is hygiene practice and sanitation procedures, as the custodial team's frequency is going to increase dramatically, wiping down high-touch surfaces and areas throughout the day and ensuring the promotion of cleanliness. But additionally, I also feel that this is one of the measures that will be the easiest to implement and enforce amongst the guests, as using hand sanitizer at the entrance and exit of the attractions and the restaurants appeals to the well-being of that guest instead, as we all know that the majority of people will be inherently more inclined to comply with practices to protect themselves rather than that of protecting others, which is unfortunate, but it's just human nature. And so that's everything that we can learn so far about the new operational changes coming to the Disney parks from Shanghai's reopening. But to be honest, I really do hope that Disney take as much time as they need to implement these new measures within Walt Disney World and Disneyland when it comes to their eventual reopening. As yes, I do see the importance of reopening Walt Disney World and Disneyland for the respective economies within those states, but I also foresee that if these measures aren't implemented properly, then it could also be a big PR hit for the Walt Disney Company and could eventually lead to an even longer recovery for the Disney parks in terms of guest attendance. And so personally, I'm going to be extremely patient when it comes to the reopening of these parks and understanding of any new rules and regulations when it comes to these new social distancing measures that Disney will have to implement to maintain the safety of the guests. But if there's one thing that's completely true and needs to be kept front of mind when it comes to these new measures, is that the further that we get away from these lockdown periods, the more that the general public will be lulled into a false sense of security when it comes to the threat of COVID-19 and a resurgence of a second wave of the virus. And so whatever measures are put into place, it really needs to tackle this idea of personal inconvenience versus community responsibility, combined with the sustained stamina of the general public to keep these measures going. And I have every confidence that Disney will find a happy medium museum in the long term. But now it's over to you, the Waltoneers, as I would like to know what are your thoughts and opinions upon these new social distancing guidelines and measures put into place in Shanghai, and how would you improve them for when they come to Disneyland and Walt Disney World in the foreseeable future. And also don't forget to put the timestamp for where the hidden Mickey appeared somewhere within this video along with your suggestion or your comment to be in the chance to win one of these official DSNY Newscast enamel pins. And congratulations to this Waltoneer here for winning this suggestion from the previous video where we were talking about the reopening date. And so that's it for today, so be sure to go ahead and subscribe down below if you're new to this channel, turn on the notification icon so therefore you always get notified whenever I release a new video, and also if you've enjoyed today's video, be sure to give this video a massive thumbs up as it really does help this channel out. And I've been Jack, you've been you, and I'll see you real soon.